This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guests are Kenton, Seth and Paul Spriggs, co-authors of a book that's just been released called The Crevice Garden, How to Make the Perfect Home for Plants from Rocky Places. This book is immensely detailed, and if you've ever had an interest in crevice aka rock gardens, or indeed have not but are curious, the book provides a comprehensive overview of the types of plants suited to growing in this style of garden, and there are many, the different looks you can create, how to build and maintain them, famous and successful examples, and why they are good from an environmental perspective. I started by asking Kenton and Paul the big and the obvious question: what is a crevice garden?
Until the book, there wasn't really a hard, fast definition. There was just sort of an understanding in the rock garden world. So Paul and I actually had a lot of late night conversations. We're like, wow, when you write the book, you have to actually define the thing. So do you remember those?
Oh, yes, I do. I remember we had written most of the book and then realized we hadn't actually written a definition of what crevice gardens are.
Yeah.
So that's near the beginning of the book. We talk about what is a crevice garden. I think it's even one of the chapter heads. So in a nutshell, I guess you could say that a crevice garden is the latest. In 100 years of rock gardening, there's been lots of different styles and techniques that have come and gone. You know, think about things like scree beds or trough gardening and all these different ways to grow alpines. Crevice gardening is really the latest and I think the greatest innovation in many ways, because the concept was invented, in the 80s by the Czechs, and it has not in any way faded out. If anything, it's getting more and more popular all the time. And it kind of seems to be the catchword of the day in rock gardening circles, mainly for two reasons. One of them is because they look amazing. When they're built well and artistically, they can really be a gorgeous feature in your garden. But from a horticultural point of view, it's a way to grow rock plants better than some of these techniques before. A lot of plants love the conditions that a crevice offers. And so a crevice garden is basically a new style to grow really cool plants in a nutshell, right?
Paul, we never looked to see if it was in any dictionary yet. Well, if
Yeah.
it winds up in the Oxford English dictionary one day, maybe it'll be a rock garden built with the intent purpose of creating crevices for plants that want it. Maybe not a sexy sounding thing, but that might be the sort of scientific, if there was, definition. As Paul said, it's made to grow plants, and that's where it came from. But there is this side effect that they also look cool. And so people are very attracted to them rocks alone, even if they didn't grow saxatile or rock loving plants so well, people still want them. In fact, I've noticed in a few places, crevice garden and rock garden are just kind of the same thing when you talk to people. Like in Denver, they're well known now because of Denver Botanic Gardens. And a lot of gardeners just say crevice garden, and they kind of mean any rock garden at this point, which is interesting that there's a conflation there, but it's a good one, And when Paul and I visited the Czech Republic to visit people's backyard rock gardens, did you see any distinction between a normal rock garden and a crevice garden? It was kind of like if you had a rock garden, it was a crevice garden, do you think?
Pretty much. Yeah, back there for sure. I mean, the Czechs, because the Czech is the homeland of the crevice garden, it certainly is the most popular style that we saw, having visited there a few times. So yeah, it's really the newest. I do not like to call it a fad by any means, because I feel like it has staying power. But a lot of people have told me that this is the future of rock gardening. Like Kenton just said, the crevice garden just falls under the umbrella of rock gardens. It is a type of rock garden, but it does have its own kind of artistic merits as well that differ from just a regular rock garden.
I think the staying power that Paul brings up is because while it seems like this really niche subset of gardening, then it has branched out again to include habitat gardening, permeable landscapes in cities, dry gardening in places that are running out of water. There's all these different uses. So crevice gardens are diversifying. And I think that's driving a lot of the longevity and that growth across the world because they're being used in different ways in different places. That's kind of the startling thing about it is they are universal, no matter how wet, how dry, tropical, temperate, Arctic, the physics of a crevice works. which is fascinating. And just when you think you've seen everything, I feel like maybe the most cutting edge or the wackiest thing I've seen is the hybrid crevice and roof garden, where instead of rocks, it's slabs of styrofoam. And as weird as that sounds, that solves like major problems of green roofs where they're too heavy to have deep root runs, and roof gardens have a complicated relationship with insulation on the roof. But when you put styrofoam blocks, that solves the problem. You added insulation and deep root run, which is like so cool. The most unlikely cross of two things. And yeah, it's exciting.
So there's innovations yet to be made. We don't think this is the beginning and the end with our book here. As more and more people discover it and more artistic people discover it, they're going to put their own slant on it, and who knows what has yet to come, really. But hopefully this book will just encourage people to get out there, experiment, and do their own thing with it.
Well, I'm sure it will. You know, I don't like to assume anything, but I think historically maybe rock gardens have been associated with drought-tolerant plants. But is that the case? And what are the advantages to putting plants in crevices?
It's funny, drought tolerance is something that everyone that doesn't know about rock gardening instantly jumps to, right? The first thing I often hear is, oh, I guess you don't have to water them, because a lot of people just make this assumption that we're just growing succulents or something and that things that can totally handle drought conditions. It's not exactly that. It is certainly true that crevice gardens require less water than most other types of gardens. And that's
they can be built to go unwatered. You can definitely do that. Yeah,
exactly. And some rock plants require water. You know, if you're growing some things, the gamut of rock plants that we grow goes everything from the driest possible things to high alpines that should never dry up, right? So it's not just you plant them and you never have to water them, but because of the depth of the soil and the depth of the crevices and the way that it can get the roots down so deeply, once established, I've found that in most climates, they really need hardly any water at all, almost no matter what you're growing, except for those real high alpine things like saxifrages and rosaceae and those types of things. Most things, once they're established, they can handle it no problem, because the soil never really dries up deep down in the crevice, no matter what the climate you're growing in. Like my climate is extremely droughty in the summertime, and I don't have to water mine in the summer. So they are really good for water conservation and low water requirements for sure.
I mean, I think gardeners think of things as drought tolerant because that's what's on plant tags, but really a crevice garden's about drainage. But the nuance of drainage is you remove the water from the top of the plant where it is, but it goes somewhere else. So a crevice garden can be used not only to create drainage in a wet climate for plants that don't want to sit in water, but we can use it in the dry American West to actually trap water if we build them a little differently. Like I'm in a totally different climate where we see 40 degrees Celsius in the summer regularly, and it's incredibly dry. And like our annual precipitation is, I think, 200 millimeters, if I'm converting 9 inches right, and it's getting drier. So we can actually use them as a water saving measure, which is really kind of fascinating that we can both save water and shed water with them, depending on where they're planted. Because the physics are universal, you know?
So thinking about that, that's a really interesting definition about the drainage. You don't necessarily want the water to just go away completely. You just want it to percolate through. And thinking about that, can crevice gardens slow down the water that comes down in the form of rain? Is it good as a kind of attenuation feature?
You could. We do that more here than where Paul's at. And so the surface of the garden would be more rough. And the media within the garden might be loose, but underneath of it, we'd probably leave a heavier soil like a clay to trap it, if that was our goal, solely to trap it. And also the contour of the garden could be a lot like terraces or berms to actually grab the water. Because the crevice effect, as Paul and I have been calling it, the physics of that is that there's drainage on the surface and inside of the ground of the crevice. And on the surface, it's like shingles on a roof. It depends on what the surface of the rocks look like as to whether that water puddles or sloughs off. And you can control that. It's up to you as the gardener holding the rock. And then also, what kind of media you use is up to you as well, whether you try to trap more of that water or drain it. And in most instances, we're using a free draining mix, since these rock plants are from at least well-drained places where there's no such thing as standing water. But you can use it to trap the water down deep, It's more about like putting the water where you want it and putting dryness where you want it.
It's really kind of a layery thing. Like most alpines and rock garden plants, they want their tops dry and they want their roots somewhat moist, right? Not sitting sodden and waterlogged, but they do want some level of moisture in the soil. So that's why the way these gardens are built is to basically make sure that tops and the crowns and the caudex and all the important bits up the top that usually has a tendency to rot is fully drained away. And of course, we do that with, as Kenton mentioned, with the soil medium. So very sandy soil, often just pure sand, which will drain away very quickly. But when you get a little deeper into the sand, you'll find that even on the hottest days, there's still a little bit of moisture down in there. So yeah, drainage is actually one of the most important concepts in this whole thing, because if you can't drain your plants properly, they're not going to do well. And the whole point of crevice gardening is to grow difficult plants well in the open garden. So drainage is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, I mean, they seem extremely versatile. You can create all sorts of microclimates, different growing media in there, different growing conditions. But one of the thoughts I had read in the book is they seem like they're quite a big undertaking. Are they necessarily expensive or tricky to install?
It's a good question.
Yes, and no.
A very yes and very no.
Yeah, I would say as far as the artistic aspect of it, that's really up to the artist, right? Every artist is different. And if you give the same pile of rocks to 10 different artists, you're going to end up with 10 very different gardens, right? But it's kind of an upfront intensity with labor and cost, but then that pays off in the long run with lower maintenance, lower watering, and everything like that. So yeah, they're a bit of an investment at the beginning. If you're doing it on your own and you're sourcing your rocks and you're kind of doing it as cheaply as possible, well, a lot of this stuff is fairly available in a lot of places. I know where I'm from, I can just steal rocks off the back logging roads on the island here and build a nice garden, and those rocks are free. But that's not always allowed in every place, right? So to answer your question, yeah, no, they're intensive up front. Without a doubt, rocks are heavy and you got to get all those materials to the site and plan it all out. But once it's done, then it's just playtime, right? And when you're planting, instead of digging a massive hole with a big shovel, you just use your old trowel and plant a little seedling or something. And in that sense, it's very low intensity, the upkeep and whatnot.
Yeah, I think that's pretty true of like any crevice garden, no matter how you do it. It is more intense up front and less later. In terms of like money or resources, there's a funny spectrum happening where like rock gardening, where you're at in the UK, where, the beginning of English-speaking rock gardening as we know it was like landed gentry were the people who had rock gardens. It was a thing for rich Victorians. So there's a little bit of that sort of flavor woven through rock gardening culture. But the funny thing is that the like crevice gardens developed in the Czech Republic during Soviet times. And these were folks who were living under quite the restrictions, not very rich people, having to use free materials and using their local plant material. Paul and I have worked on fancy public crevice gardens with, distantly sourced rock, like Far Reaches Conservancy in Washington State. That rock came from Montana. It's like, 3 states away. But a couple of days ago, we built a 1.5 ton crevice garden with cheap riprap rock. I don't know what that's called in Europe, but it's, rock for filling ditches. And that stuff cost us $65 in materials and 2 pickup loads to build, one in a park, a public park in a Denver suburb. And ironically, that riprap was the cheapest material in the rock yard. Was the sort of, and I think riprap creates the most natural looking gardens, honestly. And I think that's like the inexpensive or the blue collar possibilities are part of crevice gardening that excites me now. And Paul and I actually hope the book will reach folks that don't have the means or are not near rock piles, because like the broken concrete solution is awesome. We think that's very cool.
Someone just posted on Facebook, I forget where he's from. We have a crevice garden Facebook page. I don't know if you've seen it or not. It's called Modern Crevice Gardens. And someone just posted a fairly sizable crevice garden, and all the rocks were made of hypertufa. He actually made all the slabs, and they're all different sizes. And he's built a fairly beautiful crevice garden out of rock that he built because they didn't have rock there. I think he's from maybe Ontario or something. So if you get creative I believe you can do it all kinds of different ways. Like I say, construction sites can be a great place to get rock where I'm from. And sometimes they'll give it away for free because they're just getting rid of it anyway, right? So like I feel like Kenton said, the Europeans, especially when crevice gardens were invented, they didn't have a lot of extra money, right? They had extra time, but not a lot of extra money. And so they could be very creative. Our mentor, Steniak Slovanek, he doesn't buy rocks. He just finds them on his property and just keeps building rock gardens because he happens to live in a kind of a rocky place. And so he doesn't pay anything. Not that you could actually get rocks to his site anyway. It's almost totally inaccessible for any machines or anything. So yeah, I think that it can be done on the cheap too, for sure. A lot of it has just a matter of what's available to you. And if you have good rock there, and because different rock will create different types of gardens, and there's nice rock and there's ugly rock too. And sometimes the cheap rock is the nice stuff. Sometimes it's not.
We've seen some beautiful rock gardens made out of, the slate roof tiles in the Czech Republic. We saw some bathroom tiles. Someone was growing plants in, and the paving slabs, like sidewalk paving.
Yeah.
Who knows what?
Broken concrete, of course. That's a real big one for people that don't have rocks, because broken concrete is absolutely everywhere in the world. And
in fact, it's a disposal problem. It's expensive to get rid of.
Exactly. And so when you build a crevice garden properly with broken concrete, you'd be hard pressed to tell it's even made of concrete once the plants soften it up and look at it from a distance, because those rough edges of the broken concrete almost look like sedimentary rock themselves, right?
In fact, one of our friends called it Anthropocene limestone. It's grimy and it's, layered.
Yeah, well, I guess that takes over from our term urbanite. But anyway, there's a couple terms for what other people would call concrete. But yeah, that's just another source for people who don't have rocks handy. And I think people could really run with that concept as well. And it keeps it out of the landfill.
I feel I have to throw in there that round rocks can be used. Like historically, the Czechs used sedimentary stone that's really linear and it gives this look. And there's a minority of people just hate that linear look and dismiss crevice gardens up front from that. But it's been proven that you can do it with a round rock, whether it's river eroded, beach eroded, or glacially rounded. It's a little different, construction is, but Paula and I are here to defend the innovative rock gardener who builds a round rocked crevice garden.
Yeah, they sound good. I'd like to see one. Are there any in existence with the round rocks? Have you got any in your book? I can't recall any.
Two that popped into my head. I think one's in Portland somewhere. Oh, and they have like almost.
Oh, there's Dominique Turnbull.
Dominique's in our book. Yeah.
One of his gardens is in the case studies, and he uses round rocks that he's sourced. I believe he found them around for free.
He did. They're glacially polished moraine stones. So these beautiful silver striped things. So he just picked the prettiest ones.
Just to pick up on something you said, it's interesting because you said as they go through their lifetime, they become easier to maintain and less resource heavy. I think probably in the UK, anyone who's ever had a garden with a rock garden in it, over time, I think they probably had a heyday here. They maybe fell out of fashion. They are obviously becoming more popular. People are experimenting with that kind of growing medium because of environmental concerns. But if you've inherited a rock garden or you happen to do maybe garden maintenance, chances are you have come across one that has got a lot of perennial weeds running through it. And they can be very tricky to maintain. Once they take hold, it's kind of almost curtains, and you just find that it's a bit of a thankless task going through this rock garden, constantly battling. Are there things that you can do to avoid that in the first instance?
That's a super good question. In fact, I don't think anyone has asked about that, but that's a real thing. Like that comes up when we're consulting or whatever for tenant gardens or whatnot. Paul, do you want to start?
Well, I mean, I'm a avid weed destroyer. Anyone that's a serious gardener, there is a major difference between an annual weed and a perennial weed. Any rock gardening book that you pick up, one of the first things they're going to say in that chapter on construction is to eradicate your perennial weeds before a single rock is in the ground, right? Because there's really not much more difficult garden to get a perennial weed out of. And since we are promoting, a natural style of gardens here, in the old days, we just pull out the Roundup and give it a shot, right? But now it's much more important to be, I would say, proactive rather than reactive when it comes to perennial weeds. So it's just super crucial that you get those things out of there before you put anything on top of them. We have mentioned that there is the option of putting down some kind of a barrier, like a landscape fabric, to keep the weeds out. But your best bet is to just make sure they're all gone before you put them in. So I've definitely had the experience where I've had, in my part of the world, morning glory is particularly bad. The vining morning glory, couch grass, all kinds of different things that can get in there. But I found that if you get them out, they stay out. That's the thing about perennial weeds. Once you kind of get rid of them, they tend to stay away. Whereas annuals, you keep pulling them till the cows come home and they never stop coming, right? So in my experience, I've just been really, really diligent before I put a single grain of sand on the site to make sure all those roots are out. Otherwise, they'll come back to bite you. And there's not a lot you can do about it other than remove rocks from the garden and try to get those weeds out. But it's not easy.
There is a systemic thing about rock gardens and when they are susceptible to weeds too. I think I even read it in James Hitchmar's book, Sowing Beauty, where he was talking about soil productivity, so how much water and nutrients it has in it. And that having overproductive soils is why a lot of English rock gardens just get overtaken by perennial weeds and then eventually trees. You take them over. But Paul kind of touched on, when you're building the garden, ways of preventing that in the long term is to reduce those resources. And if a rock garden sheds water, that immediately turns the long-term tides against heavy vegetation wanting to be there. And if we use a no organics, no humates soil media, then that instantly reduces the hungry weeds that want to invade a place like that. The more we can approximate those depauperate, very mineral soils with terrible fertility in them in nature, the better we can approximate those, the more they naturally resist invasion in a garden setting.
Yeah.
As Paul pointed out, once you get that sand in there, then it's fine.
Mm-hmm. We also, of course, we top dress the gardens fairly heavily, any exposed soil with some kind of gravel. And that also, of course, keeps the weeds away as well. Makes it easy for them to pull them. But you can't get away from weeding in any kind of gardening. It's just par for the course. I've had customers where no, I want a no maintenance garden, right? It's, you just have to say there is no such thing as a no maintenance garden. It's not a thing. To me, it's just par for the course. If you've gotten your perennial weeds out, you're still going to get perennial weed seeding in there, but as long as you get them as seedlings, they don't get established. And so to me, that's just part of the deal. You can't just turn your back on the garden for 6 months and expect that there's not going to be something trying to get in there, right? So, but that being said, like Kenton said, in nutrient poor soils and with the top dressing, it's not a weed friendly place, provided you can get them out and keep them out. Yeah, it's not a huge thing. I've got a rock garden next door that my son used to live next door. Now he doesn't live there anymore. So I don't really go and maintain it very often. And I've put all of about an hour into the maintenance since probably this winter. And it's in fine shape. It looks perfect. There's hardly any weeds in it at all. So yeah, they can be very low maintenance when it comes to that too.
We mentioned this in the book. There's just a couple things too that are the nature of crevice gardens that make them lower maintenance. Having the surface paved in rocks just reduces the surface area that seeds can get into. And we have noticed that just the general crevice garden environment repels a lot of weeds, with the exception of tap-rooted weeds that blow on the wind. This is the pattern we've noticed. Those are the ones that still keep coming. And the tap-rooted plants love a crevice garden, and that includes dandelions, right? Oh, and another little thing to point out, some folks who have crevice gardens, they know that they're aging and that they can't put a whole lot of work into things as they get older, and they've embraced the crevice garden because when you're deadheading or pruning those plants, you're talking about a handful of trimmings rather than a wheelbarrow or, using loppers to cut things back. So the scale thing is real too.
Everything's easier in a crevice garden as long as you can climb up onto it and pull those weeds, right?
It can make it easier or worse for you, depending on how you do it.
Keeps you in shape anyway. Keeps the agility up.
I've got one last question for you. Can you get amongst it? Can it be usable as well as just an installation in your garden that looks nice and that is for plants?
What kind of use do you mean?
So human use, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we've seen some innovative stuff. Like the Czechs are not against having basically a goat path or a hiking path that goes through the garden very intimately. Paul and I just put steps in a crevice garden that we built together so that we had like very recognizably human, path kind of features. And other times you can build in sort of hidden steps that aren't obvious. They're just level areas that happen to be one stride away from each other that, isn't visually there, but the gardener knows about them. We stole those secrets from European gardens who've had to maintain their gardens for 100 years. So it wasn't built that way up front. They had to retrofit that in there. And that's the thing, like a crevice garden can be built tall. So it's almost like a strange raised bed whose surface is paved in rocks. And that elevation can be good, for reducing bending over and whatnot. We've seen a few gardens that were built with that in mind to make access to it. And then it has to be admitted, sometimes crevice gardens have been built that look very natural and very craggy, and you're mountain climbing to go weed those. So it's wise to design those so that you don't have to do a lot of weeding, because if every rock face is slanted next to something sharp, then like Paul said, it keeps you on your toes. Those gardens.
Crevice gardens are so versatile, they can be anything you make them. And in the book, there's even a small version in a container that I'm going to have a go at. My thanks to Kenton and Paul for being so informed and engaging. Thanks to you for listening. Now here's Dr. Ian Bedford with his Bug of the Week.
As temperatures gradually climb and daytimes lengthen, our gardens become transformed and invigorated by the appearance of fresh green leaves and pastel-coloured springtime flowers, which is the episode in nature's cyclic system that stimulates creatures throughout the animal kingdom to find the resources they'll now need to survive and reproduce. None more so than the creatures from the bug world, whose often brief lives become fraught with danger as the deadly games between predators and prey become ever more intense. Games that over millions of years have been honing and perfecting survival techniques and the weaponry that creatures use for defence and attack. And many of the techniques that different species from the bug world use to survive can be seen in action whenever we're out in our gardens. And one that's certainly worth looking out for is the flower crab spider. A spider that doesn't spin a web, but instead uses an ambush technique to catch nectar-feeding insects, such as butterflies and bees. Flower crab spiders are common in gardens where flowering plants are grown, and they're easily recognised by their crab-like shape and their ability to walk backwards and sideways. Their two pairs of front legs are also longer and stronger than their other legs, and like crab pincers, are held wide open as they remain motionless on or within the corolla of a flower, waiting for their victim to land. But bees and butterflies have relatively good eyesight, so why don't they see the spiders on the flowers and avoid them? Well, crab spiders have evolved an ability to visually scan the colour of a flower and then slowly change the colour of their body to match it, so long as it's within the pastel colour ranges of pale green, yellow, white and pink. So they'll become perfectly camouflaged as they wait on the flower, ready to snap their legs shut around a hapless victim as it lands, and inject it with venom through its long, slender fangs. Within seconds, the victim will be paralysed, and, whilst it might still appear to be feeding on the flower's nectar, its time is now over, as the crab spider underneath drains it of life. But despite the predatory skills of the flower crab spider, they're not an aggressive species, and are certainly no threat to us. Although, for the arachnophobes amongst us, it might be worth taking a closer look before smelling the flowers in the garden.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.